Berlin, January 17, 1943. Before most people even hear the engines, there's something else. A heavy, ugly pressure in the air, like the sky is being shoved downward. Then comes the whistle. Then the city shakes like it's made of paper. Underground shelters, deep ones, still rattle. Dust falls from ceilings. People press their hands over their ears, but it doesn't help. The noise isn't just loud. It feels physical, like it's inside your chest. That night wasn't the first time Berlin had been hit. It wouldn't be the last. But for Germans living through 1943, nights like that started to blur together into a single nightmare. Darkness, explosions, fire, and the sick certainty that it was going to happen again. Here's the part most Americans were never taught to picture clearly. In 1943, the air war over Germany wasn't led by the United States. It was led overwhelmingly by Britain. If you like Wubble stories that go straight at the stuff movies skip, follow this channel and turn on the bell. These are the details that change how you see the whole war. Now let's put hard numbers on it, because the numbers are the point. In 1943, the Royal Air Force dropped about 157,000 tons of bombs on Nazi Germany and occupied Europe. The U.S. Army Air Forces dropped about 10,460 tons. That's not a little less. That's a different universe. Depending on how you frame it, you're looking at roughly 15 times more overall, by tonnage, delivered by the RAF across the year, and in some breakdowns of German-focused targets, the gap looks even more extreme. And here's a comparison that hits like a brick. The RAF delivered more bomb tonnage in July 1943 alone than the Americans delivered in the entire year. Most Americans don't carry that fact around in their heads, and it's not because the records are hidden. It's because popular memory took a different path. Ask the average viewer what the bombing campaign looks like, and you'll get B-17s in bright daylight, tight formations, German fighters slicing in, flak bursting like black flowers. The story usually ends with the idea that American daylight precision bombing broke Germany's back from the sky. You know the names from the American version of the story. You've heard about famous bombers and famous crews. You've watched the clean, dramatic version where the war in the air is mostly an American show. But in 1943, Germans didn't experience the air war as mostly American. They experienced it as a double life. By day, American bombers, when the weather cooperated, hitting specific targets. By night, the RAF, again and again and again, sending huge streams of heavy bombers that turned entire neighborhoods into fire and rubble. German officers later described the fear in a simple way. Americans were dangerous in daylight, but the British were the ones who came at night, relentlessly, and made cities feel unsafe as places to exist. That's the hinge of this whole story. This is not about dunking on the United States. America's air campaign becomes massive later. American crews paid in blood too. And when the U.S. Air Arm hit full stride, it hit hard. But 1943 is a different chapter. 1943 is the year Britain carried the main weight of strategic bombing, while America was still building the machine it would later become. So the first question isn't, did the RAF dominate that year? They did. The tonnage alone makes it obvious. The real question is, how did a gap that huge get pushed so far into the shadows that talking about it today sounds like you're trying to start an argument? It's not an argument. It's a history problem, because if you only learn the war through entertainment, you start to believe the war happened the way the camera framed it. And the camera, most of the time, didn't frame Britain as the main force in the 1943 bombing campaign. To understand how unbalanced 1943 really was, it helps to look at the year like the people planning the raids did. Month by month, ton by ton. Early 1943, the RAF is already operating at a scale the Americans simply can't match yet. January, the RAF drops well over 13,000 tons. The Americans drop a few hundred. February, the RAF climbs again, roughly the mid-teens in thousands of tons. The American tonnage is still tiny by comparison. March, the RAF pushes higher, close to 20,000 tons. The Americans rise too, but they're still operating on a completely different scale. These aren't vibes. This is logistics. This is aircraft, crews, bases, fuel, bombs, training pipelines, weather capability, and operational rhythm. By 1943, the RAF has been bombing Germany for years already. They have scars and hard lessons that are basically written into their procedures. They've built the system. They've bled to build it. The Americans, meanwhile, are still climbing the learning curve. That matters more than people like to admit, because being brave isn't enough to run a strategic air campaign across a continent. You need an entire industrial and operational ecosystem. You need the planes, the trained crews, the spare parts, the airfields, the maintenance, the navigation methods, the doctrine, and the experience to survive long enough to keep doing it. Britain had been living in total war since 1939. America had been in it since late 1941. That 2-year gap is not symbolic. It's real, and it shows up in the sky in 1943. The RAF enters that year with a mature heavy bomber force, 4-engine aircraft built for long nights over Germany. Bomber Command can put large numbers over targets again and again. The U.S. 8th Air Force in Britain is still building. The aircraft are arriving, crews are arriving, units are training, tactics are being refined, and the whole system is still working out what it means to wage a major air war from foreign bases. Even basic formation discipline at scale takes time to learn. The U.S. isn't weak. It's early. Germany understands the timeline, too. German planners see what's coming. They know American production will eventually become crushing. But in 1943, the present threat, the nightly, immediate threat, is mostly British. And because the British are coming at night, Germany has to defend in ways that are totally different from daylight defense. This is where the air war splits into 2 separate wars happening in the same sky. Day defense is a fighter pilot's war. Eyesight, formation attacks, repeated passes, massed units hitting bomber boxes. Night defense becomes a radar and control war, plotting, guiding. Specialized aircraft, specialized tactics, and intercepts that are harder to repeat quickly. The result is brutal for Germany. They can't just throw one set of tools at both problems. They're forced into a kind of defensive fork in the road. To deal with RAF night raids, Germany commits major resources to night fighting: radar, control systems, specialized night fighters, flak belts around cities, and a whole structure designed around catching bomber streams in darkness. Those night fighters aren't just fighters that happen to fly at night. They're a different animal, heavier, equipped for detection and interception, built around the idea of finding bombers you can barely see. They're not easily repurposed for daylight fighting against escort fighters. Meanwhile, many of Germany's classic day fighters, fast, agile aircraft that show up in every movie, don't automatically solve the night problem. Night fighting demands training and nerve in a different way. It's a specialized craft, so Germany ends up maintaining parallel defensive systems because the RAF forces it to. And that's one reason the RAF can keep landing heavy blows even when German defenses are strong. The defender can't concentrate everything against one threat without leaving the other side open. That's the strategic trap. Defend the daylight raids, and the night raids burn your cities. Defend the night raids, and daylight bombers rip into key industries. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but the Americans were doing precision bombing. Doesn't that mean fewer bombs but more impact? Sometimes, yes, on specific targets. But the 1943 reality is that the RAF's doctrine demands mass. The British approach is built around the idea that a city isn't just a dot on a map with a factory inside it. A city is a system: workers, housing, transport, power, repairs, emergency services, warehouses, ports, rail yards, everything that keeps production alive. So the RAF's campaign is designed to smash that system through area bombing at night, using big bomber streams and a rhythm of raids that can overwhelm defenses and keep cities off balance. The American approach in 1943 leans harder toward daylight attacks on specific industrial targets when conditions allow. That's a different style of war in the air, and it produces different patterns of destruction. And Germany's own reporting, civil defense reporting, damage assessments, the cold paperwork of catastrophe reflects that difference. The night raids tend to devastate wide areas, while many daylight raids aim at narrower objectives. Again, none of this is a moral victory story. There's no clean side here. There's only what happened and what it did to human beings on the ground. But if you're trying to understand why the RAF's tonnage is so much higher, doctrine is a major piece of it. Area bombing, by design, uses more bombs. There's another piece too: weather and navigation. By 1943, the RAF is increasingly capable of finding targets at night through cloud using evolving navigation aids and radar mapping. It's not magic and it's not perfect, but it means the RAF can operate in conditions that would cancel or divert many daylight missions. The Americans in 1943 still depend heavily on visual conditions for their preferred style of attack. That's not incompetence. That's the limits of the method at that time. So when the weather is bad, the RAF can still go. When the weather is bad, the daylight campaign often loses opportunities. Now stack all of this together. More experience, more established infrastructure, a doctrine built around mass, more ability to operate through weather, and a night war that forces Germany into a separate defensive system. That is how you get 1943. That is how you get a year where the RAF is, functionally, the main strategic bombing force over Germany. And that is how you get the month that becomes the proof of concept for everything Bomber Command believes it can do. Because in July 1943, the numbers don't just show dominance. They show something darker. What happens when a mature bombing system meets the right conditions over a densely built city? Hamburg is on the calendar. And the weather that week is the kind of weather that turns a raid into an event people remember for the rest of their lives. Still air, warm night, the kind of calm where smoke hangs and heat builds. In the next part, the RAF will demonstrate, horrifically, what concentrated night bombing can do to a modern city when everything lines up. Hamburg, late July 1943. It starts like a normal summer night. If anything about wartime Germany can be called normal, the air is warm, humidity sits on the skin, there isn't much wind, sound carries farther than it should, and that detail matters more than most people realize because a city can survive a lot of things. A city struggles to survive heat with nowhere to send it. By this point in the war, Hamburg isn't just any target. It's a major port, a major industrial hub, a major population center. It's also the kind of place where you can break more than machinery. You can break routines. You can break sleep. You can break morale. And in July 1943, Bomber Command isn't experimenting anymore. They're executing. The RAF calls the overall campaign Operation Gomorrah, a series of major attacks over several days, built to keep the city off balance and to overwhelm emergency response. The British are not aiming for one clean strike. They're aiming for a sustained collapse. Across the main raids in that period, RAF heavy bombers fly in enormous numbers and drop thousands of tons of high explosive and incendiaries on the city. The U.S. daylight raids also hit Hamburg in this window, but at far smaller scale, more limited in tonnage, and narrower in the kind of damage they're designed to produce. That's not a moral judgment. It's the operational reality of two different doctrines. The American daylight approach in 1943 leans toward hitting specific industrial sites when conditions allow. The British night approach is built to do something else, to wreck the urban system that keeps industry functioning. Housing, transport, utilities, emergency services, and the psychological stability of the people who have to keep showing up to work. In Hamburg, that difference becomes visible in the plainest possible way. On one of the worst nights, July 27th into July 28th, 1943, the RAF sends a massive force, hundreds of heavy bombers, a long bomber stream crossing the coast and pushing inland. From high altitude, crews see a dim glow ahead even before the first bombs fall. It's not because the city is already burning that night. It's because the marking and the flare light begin to change the sky. Pathfinder aircraft go in first. Their job is brutally simple. Find the aim point in darkness and mark it so the main stream can hit the same area. From the ground, people look up and see colored flares hanging under parachutes, drifting down through haze and cloud. It's one of the strangest sights of the war, like slow fireworks that don't celebrate anything. Then the bombing begins. High explosive first. That is not random. It's a method. High explosive blows apart roofs, walls, and windows. It breaks water mains and power lines. It turns streets into debris. It exposes interiors, the wood, the fabric, the paper, the furniture. It creates kindling and open access in thousands of buildings at once, and then the incendiaries arrive. A mass incendiary raid does not look like the neat patterns people imagine. It is not a single line of explosions you can follow with your eyes. It is countless small ignition points appearing everywhere, almost at once, across a wide area. Incendiary devices scatter across rooftops. Many drop through shattered windows into rooms that were private and ordinary a few hours earlier. Fires start in attics and stairwells, in bedrooms, in stores, in warehouses. The effect isn't one big blaze. It's 10,000 smaller ones that the city cannot possibly fight. In one of the hardest-hit districts, areas of dense working-class housing, packed close together, with narrow streets and buildings built in tight blocks, the number of separate fires becomes impossible to track. Fire brigades and civil defense teams try to move, but roads are choked with rubble, water pressure fails, communications break down, and then the situation crosses a line that most people can't really picture until it's too late. The fires begin to merge. Not in the simple way people think, one building to the next. They merge into a single giant column of heat and smoke that starts to affect the air itself. Hot air rises violently. That rising column pulls in cooler air from the surrounding streets, and that incoming air accelerates, turning into strong winds funneled through alleys and avenues. The city begins to generate its own weather. This is what people mean when they talk about a firestorm. It is not just a lot of fires. It is a self-feeding system. Fire makes wind. Wind feeds fire. Fire intensifies. Wind intensifies. And the cycle grows faster than human response can match. Temperatures in the core can climb to levels that ruin the basics of survival. Asphalt can soften. Metal can warp. People who try to shelter underground can face suffocation as oxygen is consumed and smoke penetrates. People in the streets can be knocked down by wind and crushed by debris or trapped by flame fronts moving too fast to outrun. There is a special kind of terror in a disaster where every option becomes a bad option. What makes Hamburg so historically important, so infamous in German civil defense memory, is that this isn't just destruction. It's annihilation of functioning life in parts of the city. Afterward, German local authorities compile reports with grim precision. Whole blocks erased, emergency services overwhelmed, casualty estimates rising into the tens of thousands. The best-known figure associated with the worst firestorm night sits around 42,600 civilians killed in the wider Hamburg firestorm disaster period, a number repeated in post-war histories and contemporary assessments. Even if exact counts are debated at the margins, as they often are with mass casualty events and chaos, the scale is not in question. This is not hundreds. This is not a bad raid. This is a city event that changes how people think about air power. And while all of this is happening on the ground, the bomber stream above is still moving like an assembly line. That's another piece people miss. A mass raid is not a single explosion. It's an extended, sustained fall of ordnance over a marked area. In Hamburg, the bombing sequence lasts long enough that survivors describe it as if the sky is stuck in a permanent state of falling metal. Anti-aircraft guns fire until barrels overheat. Searchlights stab into smoke and haze and lose their targets. Night fighters attempt intercepts, but the volume of aircraft and the difficulties of night engagement mean the defense cannot stop enough bombers to prevent catastrophe. And that's the most important operational point. A night defense system can be effective and still be overwhelmed. Even if the defender shoots down bombers, the attacker only needs enough bombers to get through in numbers that make the target unmanageable. That's why bomber stream tactics matter. A concentrated flow of aircraft can saturate detection, saturate control, saturate fighters, saturate guns, and create a window where the bombs fall faster than the city can absorb. In the aftermath, the imbalance between attacker losses and ground casualties can look almost obscene. On one of the worst Hamburg firestorm raids, RAF losses are often cited at around a dozen bombers destroyed, tragic and real for the crews and families involved, and still tiny compared to what happened to the civilians below. Some accounts list roughly 17 airmen killed and dozens captured on that night's losses. That arithmetic, aircrew deaths versus civilian deaths, is one reason the moral arguments about strategic bombing never stop. And they shouldn't stop. Not if people are honest. But if you want to understand 1943 as a historical year, you can't look away from the fact that Hamburg shows what the RAF had become by that point, a force capable of delivering urban-scale destruction through sustained night operations. And it's not just one raid. That's the other part that makes Hamburg different. The RAF returns, again and again. Multiple heavy raids in a short window, enough to push the city past the point where repairs are meaningful in the near term. By early August, huge numbers of residents have fled. Industrial production is disrupted not only by damaged plants, but by missing workers, wrecked transport, shattered utilities, and a city government trying to function inside catastrophe. German leadership reactions afterward make it clear Hamburg is not treated like a routine incident. In diaries and post-war recollections, senior figures describe it as a warning of what could happen to other major cities if the same method could be repeated at scale. And that's the key. Hamburg becomes a template. High explosive to open buildings and break services. Incendiaries to ignite exposed interiors. Concentration to overwhelm defenses and response. Timing and conditions that can produce a firestorm. It's not improvisation, it's a designed effect. Now, here's the part that matters for the larger story you're watching unfold. In 1943, this isn't an Allied capability in equal proportions. This is primarily a British capability being executed under British doctrine with British operational experience. The Americans are present in the theater, and they hit important targets in daylight. They do real damage. They take real losses. But the kind of sustained night mass attack that can repeatedly push a major city toward collapse, that is still mainly the RAF's war in 1943, and the Germans respond accordingly. After Hamburg, you see the defensive logic harden, more emphasis on protecting cities at night, more resources tied to night interception, more pressure on radar networks and command systems, more proof, from Germany's point of view, that the RAF night campaign is not a sideshow. It's an existential threat to the country's ability to function, which brings the story right back to the big question. If the RAF is doing this much damage in 1943, dropping vastly more tonnage, creating outcomes like Hamburg, why do so many modern viewers still picture the air war as mostly American daylight formations? The answer isn't in the bomb bays. It's in memory. Because once you understand Hamburg, you can finally understand why German planners split the war in the air into two separate emergencies, day and night, and why they often treated the night emergency as the one that could break the nation itself. And in the next part, that split becomes the center of everything. Two air wars, two defensive systems, two kinds of fear, and one major reason the RAF could keep hammering Germany night after night, even as defenses improved. Hamburg wasn't just a tragedy, it was a demonstration. It proved that the RAF's night offensive in 1943 wasn't a side story running alongside the main American air war. It was the central pressure Germany felt, especially on its cities, because it happened in a way the German system could not easily neutralize. And to understand why the RAF could do what it did in 1943, you have to understand something most popular Rewind Fund stories barely touch. Germany was fighting two different air wars at the same time. Same enemy nation, same skies, same year. Two totally different battles. One happened in daylight, the other happened in darkness. And those two conditions forced Germany into two separate defensive worlds that didn't blend smoothly together. The day war and the night war were built on different physics. Day defense is the kind of air combat people recognize. Fighters can see bombers. They can form up. They can attack as a group. They can make repeated passes. They can coordinate visually. It's fast, aggressive, and it rewards pilots who can spot, aim, and react. Night defense is not that. Night defense is a slow, technical hunt in a sky where you can't see much of anything until you're almost on top of it. It relies heavily on radar, ground controllers, and specialized crews. It depends on positioning and timing more than dramatic dogfighting. That difference matters because it means Germany couldn't just say, "We'll defend against bombers," as one single problem. Germany had to defend against two separate kinds of bombers, arriving in two separate conditions, requiring two separate toolkits. That is a nightmare for any defender. Why the RAF forced Germany into a separate air force. By mid-1943, Germany is maintaining a large night fighter arm, aircraft and crews dedicated mainly to one job: intercept RAF bomber streams at night. Those night fighters aren't just regular fighters flying after dark. They tend to be heavier, often multi-engine, equipped for night interception, and tied into a radar and control system that tells them where to go. And here's the catch: a night fighter setup like that is not easily repurposed for daylight combat. Put those heavier aircraft into daylight, and they're at a disadvantage against fast escort fighters and agile single-engine interceptors. Put a day fighter pilot into night combat without the right training and the right tools, and the results can be useless or fatal. So Germany is forced into a split: maintain day fighters to hit American bombers, maintain night fighters and flak belts to counter RAF bomber streams. Those are overlapping goals, but they draw on different resources, different equipment, and different training. Germany cannot merge them into one perfect solution, and that helps explain why, in 1943, the RAF can keep getting through in huge numbers even when German defenses improve. The defender can hurt the bomber stream, but the defender can't easily stop it. At night, each interception is hard, each kill takes time. Even a successful night fighter crew usually gets only a limited number of true intercept opportunities in one mission window. That means the math starts to favor the attacker, as long as the attacker can keep sending large streams. A day fighter unit can sometimes attack a bomber formation multiple times in one sortie, especially in daylight conditions where regrouping and re-engagement is more practical. A night fighter crew has to find the stream, get positioned, approach without being spotted, fire at close range, and then break away safely in darkness. While they do that, hundreds of bombers keep moving forward. So even if Germany has a solid night defense system, it often becomes a system designed for attrition, bleeding bomber command over time, rather than preventing raids from landing heavy damage on a given night. And that's exactly what German planners try to do. They can't shut the RAF down quickly, so they try to grind it down. The price of RAF dominance in 1943, this is where the story stops being just about bomb tonnage and turns into something harder to absorb. In 1943, RAF Bomber Command loses roughly 8,125 aircrew killed. The U.S. bomber forces lose roughly 2,385 aircrew killed. Those are both brutal numbers. But when you place them next to the tonnage figures, you see the nature of the RAF's war in 1943. More sorties, more nights, more exposure, and a style of operations that keeps pushing into defended airspace without the kind of escort picture the Americans would later build. You also see why Bomber Command's story is not an easy Hollywood story. It doesn't look like a tight group of heroes fighting their way through one big mission and coming home to cheers. It looks like a long, grinding industrial process where men are lost steadily, night after night, until loss becomes routine. And the loss rates aren't just a little scary. They are mathematically terrifying. The RAF's major raid loss rates in 1943 often sit in the low single digits per mission on average. That doesn't sound catastrophic until you realize a standard RAF heavy bomber tour is 30 operations. Now do the math the way a crew would do it, even if they tried not to. If you lose, say, around 3 to 4% of crews per operation on average, and you do that repeatedly, your chance of surviving a full tour drops fast. It becomes the kind of probability problem that makes grown men stop talking and stare at their boots. And that's before you factor in the bad periods, when losses spike higher on tough targets or when German defenses get sharper. This is why the RAF's 1943 dominance is inseparable from the RAF's 1943 suffering. To maintain that tonnage, those bomber streams, those repeated major raids, Bomber Command is paying in blood constantly. And Germany knows it. German defenses are built to make those losses climb. Radar networks, flak belts, night fighter control systems, intercept tactics, improvements over time. By late 1943, RAF loss rates in some periods and against some targets are climbing into truly dangerous territory. The bombers still come, but the cost keeps rising. So why did they keep flying? This is where the story gets uncomfortable. because it forces you to look at the war the way decision-makers looked at it. Britain is not bombing Germany because it enjoys bombing. Britain bombs Germany because Britain believes it has no other way to apply major force directly against the Reich in 1943 on the scale needed to matter. In the earlier years, Britain is on the defensive, fighting for survival, protecting shipping, rebuilding its army, and holding on. Strategic bombing becomes one of the only tools Britain can use to strike Germany hard at range while waiting for the ground war in the West to become possible. And by 1943, Bomber Command is not a side project. It's a pillar of Britain's war plan. So when losses are terrible, the logic becomes grim. If they stop, what replaces it? The answer isn't clean. It's not inspiring. It's basically, if Britain cannot keep pressure on Germany, Germany can shift more resources elsewhere, strengthen other fronts, and extend the war. And Britain has already learned what a long war without pressure can mean. So Bomber Command keeps going. Not because the odds are friendly, because the stakes are national. And the way Bomber Command stays alive, organizationally, is not magic. It's systems. Training pipelines that feed new crews into squadrons, replacement aircraft arriving to cover losses, Commonwealth participation and recruitment across a wider pool of manpower, and, underneath it all, a hard institutional acceptance that a certain level of attrition is the cost of doing this kind of war. That doesn't mean every leader feels good about it. It means the machine is built to continue. America in 1943, dangerous, growing, but still early. Now swing back to the American side for a second. The U.S. Daylight Campaign in 1943 is real, and it is dangerous. American bombers face heavy fighter opposition on deep raids, and the lack of long-range escort early on makes some missions punishing. That is historically clear. The Americans get hit hard on some deep penetrations. Loss rates can spike to levels that cause real alarm and force changes. But here's what still stays true in 1943. The U.S. bombing force is not yet operating at the scale that defines the year. America is building toward that scale. Training crews, expanding groups, refining tactics, sorting out logistics, getting aircraft across the Atlantic, building bases, learning how to maintain tempo. And weather still limits what daylight bombing can do, especially if you're relying heavily on visual conditions for the style of attack you prefer. The RAF, by contrast, is built to operate at night, and increasingly through poor conditions using the tools and methods it has developed over years. So the disparity continues. Even as America grows in 1943, the RAF remains the heavier hammer, especially measured in tonnage. And Germany's defensive allocations reflect that. Germany cannot ignore the Americans, but it cannot treat the Americans as the top priority yet. Not in 1943, not when the RAF is coming again tonight. 2 campaigns, 2 effects on Germany. There is another difference, one that shows up again and again in German recovery and production patterns. Daylight precision-style raids aim to damage specific facilities and production nodes. When successful, they can seriously disrupt output. They can force repairs. They can break machinery. They can interrupt a supply chain. But there is a pathway to recovery. Rebuild, repair, disperse, move production, create redundancy. Night area bombing at large scale aims to wreck the broader environment that allows production to exist. Housing, transport, utilities, municipal services, and the morale and stability of the labor force. That kind of damage is slower to recover from because it's not just fix the factory, it's rebuild the city around the factory. And again, that doesn't create moral clarity. It creates historical clarity about why Germany experiences the RAF campaign as existential in 1943. It isn't just that the RAF drops more bombs. It's that the RAF's method is designed to break urban life as a functioning system. And Hamburg proves that the system can, in fact, be pushed into collapse, the turning point that isn't in most American memory. So by the end of 1943, you have this reality. Britain has carried the strategic bombing burden for years and still dominates tonnage that year. The RAF has suffered extreme losses while maintaining tempo. Germany has been forced into 2 separate defense problems, one of them largely built around countering the night war. America is growing into the role that will become dominant later, but it's not the main weight in 1943. And yet, When most Americans picture the bombing war, they don't picture the RAF's nightly stream as the centerpiece of 1943. They picture American daylight formations as the main event. That gap between what happened and what gets remembered is not an accident of data. It's a product of storytelling. Because after the war, the nation that produces the most movies and the most global entertainment tends to produce the default version of history most people absorb. And when you build story after story around one perspective, audiences slowly start to treat that perspective as the whole reality. Not because the details shown are always wrong, because the context missing is enormous. This is where the story is headed next, not back into the bomb bays, but into the way memory gets shaped, how a true set of events can be turned into a popular narrative that feels complete while leaving out the biggest statistical fact of 1943. By the end of 1943, the record is not subtle. Britain's bomber command has dropped roughly 157,000 tons of bombs across Nazi Germany and occupied Europe. The U.S. Army Air Forces, still building its European striking power, has dropped roughly 10 to 460 tons in the same year. Even if you slice the accounting different ways, Germany-only targets, occupied targets included, what a given source counts as strategic, the core reality doesn't change. In 1943, one Air Force is carrying the bulk of the tonnage, the bulk of the night pressure, and a massive share of the loss. And it's not the one most American audiences picture when they hear the bombing campaign. So how does something that big fade from popular memory? Not from archives, not from official histories, from the everyday mental picture people carry around. The answer is simpler than people expect, and that's what makes it powerful. History doesn't disappear only when documents are destroyed. It disappears when stories become the main way people learn the past. And the air war over Germany is one of the clearest examples of that. The easiest way to rewrite history is to show true things in a false frame. Most popular depictions of American daylight bombing aren't fake in the cheap sense. B-17s really flew in tight formations. German fighters really attacked. Flak really burst. Crews really died. The fear, the cold, the damage, the brutal odds, those parts are real. The trick isn't that the details are invented, it's that the details are presented inside a frame that quietly implies a strategic reality that isn't accurate for 1943. If you show American bombers in 1943 as the center of the air war, and you do it over and over, most viewers will naturally assume America is carrying the main load. The RAF doesn't need to be insulted, it doesn't need to be mocked, it only needs to be mostly absent. That absence does the work, because omission is persuasive when the viewer doesn't know what's missing. If you never show the massive night bomber streams, never show the repeated rhythm of "again tonight," never show the scale of Bomber Command's tonnage in that year, then the audience walks away with a clean conclusion. This is what the bombing campaign was. And that is how you end up with a generation that could name an American bomber film, but couldn't tell you what a Lancaster or a Pathfinder force did, even though those were central to the RAF's ability to operate at scale at night. Why American stories dominate the global memory of the air war. After the war, the United States becomes the dominant producer of mass entertainment. That matters. It matters because the stories that reach the most people, the fastest, and the most consistently become the default version of events in the public mind. And American entertainment naturally centers Americans. That doesn't require a conspiracy meeting in a smoke-filled room. It's just how a huge media market behaves. A production funded for an American audience will usually focus on American characters and American units. That's normal. It's also how you get a warped public understanding when that focus becomes the only version widely consumed. So over decades, American film and television do something very consistent. They depict the bombing war with American crews as the main lens. They may include British allies in the background, sometimes with respect, sometimes as scenery, sometimes not at all. But the strategic context rarely lands clearly. That in 1943, the RAF is dropping vastly more tonnage, and Germany is prioritizing defenses against that night war because it threatens cities as living systems. If you don't show that context, the audience fills the gap with assumptions. They assume what they're seeing is the whole picture. Precision is easier to film than attrition. There's another reason the RAF story is harder for mainstream entertainment. Bomber Command's 1943 campaign is repetitive in a way that is historically accurate, but narratively harsh. It's night after night, mission after mission, a grinder where the hero doesn't win because he's the best. He survives because he wasn't hit this time. That's not a clean arc. It's not a neat one last mission structure. American daylight bombing stories, especially as they're often told, fit film structure better. A daylight raid is visually clear. The audience can see the formations. They can see the fighters. They can track what's happening. Night bombing is harder to depict without making it either confusing or stylized. Darkness looks like nothing on screen unless you cheat with lighting. And once you cheat too much, the realism breaks. So entertainment drifts toward what it can show well. And it also drifts toward what lets the audience feel morally comfortable. The American self-image around wartime likes the idea of precision, aimed targets, military objectives, the concept of minimizing civilian casualties. Whether that image matches the messy reality across the full war is a separate discussion. But as a story, it's comfortable. Area bombing and the deliberate targeting of the city system is uncomfortable. It raises moral questions you can't dodge. It forces viewers to sit with civilian death as an intended outcome of doctrine, not just collateral damage. And that makes it harder to package as a heroic national myth. So popular memory leans toward the story that feels cleaner. Not because the other story didn't happen, because the other story is harder to watch and harder to sell. Britain's contribution didn't vanish. Only because America told its own story, Britain also played a role in how this got remembered. After the war, Britain had its own reasons to be cautious about emphasizing the bombing campaign. The moral debate over area bombing never went away. It is still debated by historians and the public. That debate naturally pushes a culture into a more restrained posture about celebrating the campaign. Also, Britain's post-war identity took hits. Empire shrinking, economic strain, rebuilding, a different global position. There wasn't the same appetite or global reach to export a constant stream of big-budget stories centered on Bomber Command across the world. So you get an imbalance in storytelling power. America keeps producing the air war as an American story. Britain produces fewer mass-market depictions of the sustained night offensive as the central story. Over time, the public doesn't choose an interpretation. They absorb the only interpretation they're repeatedly shown. And once an interpretation feels familiar, it feels true. Enemy testimony isn't popular entertainment, but it's often brutally clarifying. There's another missing piece in most popular depictions: the enemy perspective as a source of strategic context. German records are full of practical clarity, civil defense reports, damage assessments, air defense allocation memos, interrogations after the war, and those sources tend to emphasize something many modern viewers don't expect. In 1943, Germany's defensive system is heavily oriented toward the night threat because the night threat is frequent, massive, and destabilizing to cities. That does not mean the Americans were harmless. It means that in 1943, one threat feels relentless in a way the other hasn't yet achieved at scale. A German fighter commander describing fear of American daylight raids and dread of British night raids is not praising anybody. It's describing a defensive reality. But those German perspectives don't sell the kind of heroic story entertainment prefers, so they're rarely used to frame the narrative, even when the details they'd add are essential to understanding the year. The numbers don't compete with 1,000 hours of film. Here's the hard truth. Most people don't learn UE2 from tonnage tables. They learn it from what they watched. That's not an insult. It's how modern memory works. Visual media is more emotionally sticky than statistics. So even if the official histories are available, even if academic works lay out the numbers, even if the RAF's operational records are clear, those sources don't shape the average person's mental picture unless something pushes them to look. And most people don't go looking because they don't suspect there's a gap. That's why the RAF's 1943 dominance is such a useful example of how public memory can drift. You can have a fact that is numerically overwhelming, documented from multiple sides, and still have it feel surprising because the stories people consumed never framed it as central. This isn't about replacing one myth with another. At this point, some people react the wrong way. They hear the RAF carried the bombing burden in 1943, and they think the claim is America didn't matter. That's not the claim. The U.S. bombing campaign expands rapidly. The Americans become crushing later. They suffer heavily, and they force major tactical and strategic changes. They also help create the combined pressure that eventually overwhelms Germany. But timing matters. Scale matters. And 1943 specifically is not the year where America dominates the strategic bombing war by tonnage. It's the year where Britain, already in the fight for years, pushes a mature night offensive, while America is still building the machine it will later wield. Saying that isn't anti-American, it's pro-reality. And it also honors the people on the other side of the channel who climbed into aircraft, knowing the odds were brutal, and went anyway. What the 1943 air war really forces you to ask, once you accept this 1943 reality, a bigger question starts to press in. If something as measurable as bomb tonnage can be blurred in popular memory, what else might be simplified, recentered, or partially erased by the way we consume war history? Because the RAF story isn't the only place where the popular narrative can tilt away from strategic truth. The war is enormous. The contributions of allies are enormous. The scale of the Eastern Front is enormous. The merchant shipping war, the Mediterranean, the long years before 1944, none of these fit neatly into a single nation's heroic timeline. And most entertainment has to pick a timeline. It has to pick a protagonist. When it does, it becomes a story, not a full map. That's fine, until people treat the story as the map. So here's the honest takeaway. The air war over Germany in 1943 was not the clean, single-thread narrative most Americans grew up with. It was two campaigns in parallel, day and night, hitting the same enemy, forcing different defenses, producing different kinds of destruction. And in that year, the RAF's night campaign was the heavier weight by tonnage and by relentless presence. The Germans felt it in their cities. The RAF paid for it in its crews. And the world mostly forgot it because the stories that reached the most people didn't keep it in frame. That is the final twist of the bombing campaign. Not just what bombs did to buildings, what stories did to memory. The numbers are still there. The operational logs are still there. The losses are still there. The question is whether modern audiences are willing to let the record reshape the picture in their heads, whether they'll accept that W1 was bigger, messier, and more shared than the cleanest versions of the story make it feel. Because if you can correct the air war in 1943, you can start correcting the rest of the war too. And once you start doing that, you stop watching documentaries as mythology. You start seeing it as what it really was. A massive coalition struggle, paid for in lives and cities, and years of attrition, with no single nation carrying every chapter, even if one nation produced most of the movies afterward. In 1943, the RAF carried the bombing tonnage. The Germans counted it. The records kept it. And now you do too.